A deputy sheriff opened a trunk on a farm in West Virginia and found the belongings of 31 missing people. Rings, watches, a child's toy. But here's what made him stop breathing. The trunk was organized, everything labeled, everything dated. Whoever kept that trunk didn't feel guilt. They felt pride. And the most terrifying part? He was sitting across from them when he realized it. But to understand what he found in that trunk, and what it truly meant, you have to go back to the beginning. To a September morning in Pendleton County, West Virginia, when the world still looked the way it always did. The morning Danny Brooks first drove out to the Harper farm. The world looked the way it always did in late September, along the hollows of Pendleton County, West Virginia. Mist lay thick in the low places between the ridges, and the maple trees along the creek had just begun to turn, their leaves catching the early light in shades of copper and dried blood. It was the kind of morning that made a man forget, briefly, that anything in the world could go wrong. He had received the complaint the evening before, passed along by old Emmett Caulfield, who lived on the far side of the ridge and had not seen smoke from the Harper chimney in going on 11 days. That alone was not enough to trouble a man deeply. Folks out here kept their own counsel, and a farmer with a sick animal or a leaking roof had little time for the ordinary rhythms of daily life. But Emmett had added something that stayed with Brooks through a restless night. He said the Harper dog, a big brindle hound named Roscoe that barked at anything moving within half a mile of the property, had not made a sound in all that time either. Not once. Brooks parked his truck at the base of the long dirt track leading up to the farmhouse and walked the rest of the way on foot. He had learned long ago that arriving quietly gave a man time to read a place before the place had time to read him. The track wound between two pasture fields, both overgrown in the way that comes not from a week of neglect, but from a season of it. The fence rails along the right side had been mended recently, the new wood pale and raw against the older grey timber. But the gate at the top of the track stood open, swinging gently on one hinge in the cool morning air. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story structure of whitewashed clapboard with a covered porch running the full width of the front. Someone had planted morning glories along the porch rail, and they had climbed well and bloomed blue and purple all through the summer, though they were past their best now. A rocking chair sat on the porch, and beside it a pair of women's work boots, neatly placed, the laces tucked inside. There was a coffee tin on the rail that still held the dead brown stubs of several cigarettes. Brooks stood at the base of the porch steps and called out, announcing himself, his voice going out into that still air and returning nothing. He knocked 3 times on the front door, waited, knocked again. When he tried the handle, the door swung inward without resistance. Inside, the house was as orderly as a church on a Monday morning. Dishes stacked clean beside the wash basin, a woman's apron folded over the back of a kitchen chair, the table set for 2, plates and cups in their proper places, a jar of blackberry preserves centered between them, as if company were expected. The wood stove was cold, but the kindling box beside it was full. A Bible lay open on the parlour windowsill, its pages weighted against the draught by a smooth river stone. It was the kind of tidiness that a woman makes when she is expecting someone to look. Not the ordinary order of daily life, which always carries the small evidence of living. A cup moved, a chair pushed back, a coat hung crookedly on its hook. This was something deliberate and composed, and it produced in Brooks a sensation he would later struggle to articulate precisely. It was something close to the feeling of a held breath. He moved through the house, room by room, noting everything without touching. A man's boots by the back door, laced and upright. A shaving kit on the bedroom washstand, the razor laid parallel to the basin, with a care that seemed excessive. In the second bedroom, which appeared to have been used for storage, he found trunks and boxes stacked along the wall. Most were ordinary enough, holding the accumulated objects of a farming life: old tools, folded feed sacks, mason jars. But the last trunk, pushed against the far wall and secured with a padlock that was newer and heavier than anything else in the room, stopped him completely. He did not force it that morning. He stood before it for a long moment, then walked back through the tidy house, out onto the porch, and down the steps into the September air. He stood in the yard, with his hands in his coat pockets, and looked out over the overgrown pasture and the ridgeline beyond it, where the mist was just beginning to pull apart. Somewhere in the trees at the edge of the property, a single crow called once and went silent. He came back the next morning with the county sheriff, Walter Pruitt, and a deputy named Calvin Sears, who was 23 years old and had never worked a case more serious than a stolen mule. Pruitt brought a bolt cutter for the padlock, which snapped on the second attempt. The three men stood around the open trunk in the storage room and looked at what it contained without speaking for a long time. There were personal effects, perhaps 30 or 40 items, arranged with a neatness that was itself disturbing, as if they had been catalogued and stored rather than simply gathered. A man's pocket watch with a cracked crystal, a woman's brooch of tarnished silver set with a small green stone, 3 wedding bands of different sizes, a child's wooden toy, a carved horse with a broken leg, painted red, letters still in their envelopes, addressed to names that meant nothing to Brooks, but were clearly not Harper. A man's wallet containing $2 and a photograph of a woman and 2 children standing before a house neither Brooks nor Pruitt recognized. And at the bottom of the trunk, beneath a folded piece of oilcloth, a small notebook bound in brown leather, its pages filled front to back in a tight, controlled hand. Brooks carried the notebook to the window where the light was better and read in silence, while Pruitt and Sears continued examining the other contents of the trunk. The entries were dated and brief. Each one recorded a name, a date, a point of origin, and a brief physical description. A peddler out of Elkins, March of 1911. A widow travelling to her daughter in Marlinton, July of 1912. A young man seeking mine work in Tucker County, November of 1912. A travelling Methodist preacher, April of 1913. And on, entry after entry, covering 5 years, 31 names in total, each one marked at the end with a single small notation that Brooks read 3 times before the full weight of it settled into him. The notation was a date, written in a slightly different ink, as if added later. It was always approximately 2 or 3 days after the entry date. It was always the last thing written about that person. He closed the notebook carefully and stood for a moment with it in his hands, looking out the window at the overgrown pasture. He spent the following 2 weeks moving between county courthouses and church registries, writing letters to sheriffs in a dozen neighboring counties and receiving replies that came back slow through the mountain mail. The pattern that emerged from this work was not dramatic. It assembled itself quietly, name by name, the way a fog assembles itself in a hollow, until suddenly the whole valley is filled with something that was not there before, and you cannot see more than 10 feet in any direction. Of the 31 names in the notebook, he was able to confirm 22 as real individuals who had been reported missing by family members, employers, or church communities at various points over the preceding 5 years. None of them had been found. None had sent word of their whereabouts. They had travelled toward this part of the mountains and then ceased to exist in any record. The Harper farm sat at the junction of two old droving trails that crossed the ridge at a low gap. Before the motor roads came through the county, it had been a natural stopping point for anyone travelling between the settlements on either side of the mountains. A farmhouse here would have seen a steady traffic of strangers, travellers seeking water, a meal, a night's shelter in the barn, before pushing on at first light. Brooks stood at the gap on the ridge one afternoon and looked down at the farm below him and understood, with a cold and unhurried clarity, what the place had been used for. The question that remained, and it was a question that would consume him for months, was where Nathaniel and Clara Harper had gone, and which of them had kept the notebook. They found Clara Harper on the 15th day of October, 11 miles into the National Forest on the Virginia side of the ridge. A timber surveyor named Hoskins came across her, sitting with her back against a fallen oak beside a creek, wrapped in a man's coat that was too large for her, her feet bare on the cold ground. He thought at first she was dead. She was not dead, but she was close enough to it that Hoskins left his pack with her and ran 3 miles to the nearest telephone to call for help. Brooks drove out to meet the wagon that brought her back. He had seen the photographs from the farm, had formed a picture of Clara Harper from the few neighbours who knew her. A quiet woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, with careful manners and a habit of looking just slightly past the person she was speaking to. The woman they lifted down from the wagon was a diminished version of that picture. Her face was abraded from the brush, her lips cracked and whitened, her hands so swollen from cold that she could not close her fingers properly. She moved with the stiff, deliberate caution of someone in significant pain. And when she reached the ground and her legs nearly gave beneath her, Brooks stepped forward and caught her without thinking. She gripped his forearm with both of her ruined hands and held on. And for a moment, she pressed her face against his shoulder with an exhaustion that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than the body. He stood very still. He could feel her breathing, shallow and rapid, against his coat. He drove her to the county doctor himself and sat in the outer room while she was examined, and afterward he sat beside her bed in the recovery room while she slept. He told himself he was doing this because she was a material witness and he could not afford to lose her. He may even have believed it at the time. When she woke, it was late afternoon, and the light through the room's single window was the colour of old amber. She looked at him for a long moment before she spoke, as if she were deciding something. "He left me out there," she said. Her voice was very quiet and carried no particular emotion, which was somehow worse than weeping would have been. "He said I would slow him down. He said the law would be looking for 2 people, and he would travel faster alone." She paused. "He tied my wrists to a branch with his belt, and took my shoes so I wouldn't follow." Brooks asked her where Nathaniel had gone. "I don't know exactly," she said. "West, I think."
He talked sometimes about the Ozark country in Arkansas. He said a man could disappear there easier than anywhere else in the American mountains. He said the people there asked fewer questions than they did here. Brooks wrote this down in his notebook. She watched him write and did not speak again until he looked up. "You found the trunk," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "Then you know what he did." He looked at her. Her eyes were dark and very steady, and her expression was one he could not entirely read, somewhere between grief and a kind of careful attention. "I know what happened on that farm,"
he said. "I am still working out the rest of it." She said nothing to that. After a moment, she turned her face toward the window and looked out at the fading afternoon, and Brooks sat with his notebook open on his knee and studied her profile, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who cannot tell with certainty whether the person in front of him is a survivor or a performance. Over the following weeks, Clara Harper talked. She talked to Brooks, and she talked to Pruitt, and eventually she talked to the county attorney, a methodical man named Gerald Fitch, who had prosecuted perhaps 4 murder cases in 20 years of practice, and found himself now in entirely unfamiliar territory. She told her story consistently, in broad outline, though the details shifted in ways that were small enough to be attributed to the imprecision of memory, and large enough to unsettle anyone paying close attention. Her account was this. Nathaniel Harper had been the architect of everything. He had chosen the farm for its location on the old crossing trails. He had cultivated the reputation of a hospitable homestead where a tired traveller could find a meal and a bed. The notebook had been his. The trunk had been his. She had known something was wrong from early in their marriage, had suspected the truth only gradually, and had been too frightened of Nathaniel to act or to flee. It was a coherent story. It was a story that fit the facts as they were available, and it was told with a composure that Brooks found difficult to reconcile with the picture it painted of a woman trapped for years in proximity to serial murder. He drove back out to the Harper farm twice during those weeks, walking the property alone in the grey October light, studying the outbuildings and the land around them. Behind the barn, he found the remnants of a fire pit that was older and more substantial than a burning of brush or refuse would require. The ground around it had been disturbed and resettled over time, and when he brought men with shovels, they found nothing definitive but a quality of soil, darker and richer than the surrounding earth, that told a story he could not enter into evidence. It was on the second of these visits, in the late afternoon when the light was almost gone, that he found the thing that had been troubling him, without his being able to name it. He stood in the kitchen of the empty house and looked at the table set for 2, which they had left as they found it, plates and cups and the jar of preserves, and understood, finally, what had been wrong with it from the beginning. The table was set on both sides. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 chairs pulled out at equal angles. But there was no cookpot on the stove, no bread in the bread box, nothing in the house that suggested a meal in preparation. The table had been set, and then the kitchen had been cleared of everything that would suggest when or why. It looked like a stage set rather than a kitchen. It was as if someone had arranged the appearance of ordinary domestic life at the last possible moment before leaving, wanting the room to read a certain way to whoever came through the door. He stood there in the gathering dark for a long time, thinking about who sets a table when they are leaving and what they want the table to say. 2 nights later, camped on the ridge with Pruitt and 2 men they had recruited to search the forest approaches to the farm, Brooks sat by the fire late, while the others slept. Clara Harper had asked to come, had argued that she knew the land and could be useful, and Pruitt had agreed over Brooks's objection. She sat across the fire from him now, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames with an expression of private thought. "You don't believe me," she said, without looking up from the fire. "I believe you were in that house," he said. She looked at him then. "That isn't what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped between them and sent a brief column of sparks up into the dark. On the ridge above them, an owl called in the timber. "There are things in your story," he said carefully, that don't quite sit level with what we found. Such as the notebook, 31 entries over 5 years, in the same hand, the same pen pressure, the same habit of notation. It's not a record kept under duress. It's a record kept by someone who found the keeping of it comfortable, habitual. She held his gaze and did not look away. Nathaniel was a very particular man, she said. Very organized, very deliberate. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. Was the handwriting his? She turned back to the fire. The flames had subsided to a lower burn, red and amber, and her face in that light was something he could not quite assemble into a single, readable thing. You should sleep, she said after a long silence.
Tomorrow will be hard walking.
He stayed awake another hour, listening to the forest around the camp, and thought about the way she had not answered the question, and whether the not answering was itself an answer, or whether he was by now too deep inside the case to trust his own reading of anything. They found the letter in the last week of October, in an abandoned hunting cabin 10 miles west of the Harper farm, on a forested bench above a small, dark pond. The cabin had not been used for years before someone had recently reoccupied it for a short period, perhaps a week, perhaps 2. There were food stores hidden beneath the floorboards, canned goods and dried meat, and a box of ammunition. There was a blanket and a change of men's clothing. And on the rough table near the window, held in place by a stone, was a folded letter written on 3 pages of notebook paper. It was addressed to no one in particular. It began simply, I am writing this because I expect it will be found, and I want the record to be complete, even if I am not here to give it. The letter was signed Nathaniel Harper, and it was a full confession to the deaths of 29 people over 5 years of operation at the farm on Pendleton Road. It described the method, which was a hospitality extended to solitary travellers, a meal and a night's lodging, and what followed in the darkness. It described the disposal of remains in terms that Brooks read through once and did not read again. It stated clearly and repeatedly that Clara Harper had been an unwilling witness, kept compliant through fear and isolation, and that she had taken no active part in any of it. Brooks read the letter 3 times at the table in the hunting cabin, while Pruitt watched him from across the room. Well, Pruitt said, that's that. Brooks did not say anything. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in his coat pocket and walked to the window and looked out at the dark pond below. The letter was too clean. That was the thought that came to him and that would not leave. A man writing in extremity, in fear, in whatever state Nathaniel Harper was in when he sat at that table, did not write with this degree of compositional control. The sentences were even and measured. The chronology was orderly. Each victim was accounted for in the same methodical notation that characterized the entries in the notebook. It read like a document that had been drafted and revised, not like a confession wrested out by conscience or desperation. And there was one other thing. The letter placed Clara in the farmhouse during every incident it described. It accounted for her presence, explained her behavior, constructed her innocence, with a thoroughness that was almost lawyerly. A man confessing his own crimes did not usually spend so much effort establishing someone else's innocence. He confessed to himself. He did not write briefs. Brooks said none of this to Pruitt that afternoon. He said none of it at the subsequent hearing, where Clara Harper sat pale and composed in the front row, and the letter was entered into evidence. He said none of it because he could not prove anything. And in the law, what you cannot prove does not exist. But he knew the shape of it. He had known the shape of it since the night by the fire on the ridge, since the table set for two in an empty kitchen, since the moment she had gripped his arm with both hands and pressed her face against his shoulder with that particular quality of exhaustion, which he now understood had not been the exhaustion of a woman who had survived the wilderness alone for 11 days, but the exhaustion of a woman who had been performing something for a very long time, and was finally close enough to the end of the performance to let some of the weight of it show.
The trial was held in Elkins in February of 1917, in a courthouse that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the cold that came up through the floorboards from the frozen ground beneath. Clara Harper was charged with 2 counts of murder, the minimum that Fitch believed he could prove beyond the standard the law required. Nathaniel Harper was charged in absentia with 29 counts. He had not been found. Clara Harper's defense attorney, a Morgantown man named Aldous Webb, who had been brought in by a lawyers' association interested in the case, argued that his client was a victim of sustained coercion, a woman trapped by circumstance and fear in a situation not of her making. He pointed to the letter. He pointed to the testimony of neighbors who described Clara as quiet, passive, rarely seen in town, a woman who showed no evidence of independent agency in any area of her life. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned verdicts of guilty on both counts, which carried sentences of 20 years each to be served concurrently. There were women in the gallery who wept when the verdict was read. There was also one woman, the sister of a man named in the notebook, who stood up and said something that was quickly suppressed by the bailiff, but that Brooks, sitting near the back of the room, heard clearly. He drove back to Pendleton County that evening in the last of the winter light, the mountains rising blue and white on either side of the road. He had taken the notebook from the evidence box, as was his right as the lead investigative officer, to hold it until the appeals process was complete. He had looked at the handwriting many times by now. He had looked at Clara Harper's signature on the statement she had given to Fitch's office and at the household accounts she had maintained, which had been entered into evidence as exhibits. He had compared them in a way that was not admissible and not scientific, but that told him what he needed to know. The handwriting in the notebook was hers, not Nathaniel's, not a shared habit, not a coincidence of formation. The particular way the letter G dropped below the line, the way the capital N was made in 2 strokes rather than 3, the consistent pressure on the down strokes. These were all present in the notebook and in Clara Harper's own documented writing. And they were not present in the one authenticated sample of Nathaniel Harper's handwriting that Brooks had been able to locate. A land deed signed in 1908 and held in the county records. He had not brought this to Fitch. He had sat with it through the trial and had not spoken it aloud to anyone, partly because the chain of authentication was imperfect and would not have survived a competent challenge in court, and partly because of something harder to name. Something that had to do with the 11 days she had spent in the forest, the tied wrists, the missing shoes, the genuine damage to her hands and feet that the doctor had documented, the way she had gripped his arm on the day she came back. Even now, he was not entirely certain. That was the trap she had built, if she had built one at all. Certainty was the one thing she had never given him. He stopped the truck on the high road above the valley and sat for a moment with the engine running and looked down at the county spread below him in the winter dusk, the dark lines of the creeks, the scattered lights of farms, the long blue ridges running north and south as far as he could see.
He thought about Nathaniel Harper, about whether there was a real Nathaniel Harper moving through the forests of the Ozarks at this moment, or whether Nathaniel Harper was a figure who had been assembled for a purpose and then released into the landscape like smoke, leaving behind only a letter that said exactly what was needed and nothing else. He thought about the 31 names in the notebook.
He thought about what it took to write each of those entries, with that quality of composure, that clinical precision, adding the final date in slightly different ink 2 or 3 days after the first, not in a hand shaking with guilt or horror, but in a hand that was simply completing the record. He put the truck back in gear and drove down into the valley. Clara Harper served 4 years of her sentence before a sympathetic circuit judge reviewed the case and determined that the evidence of coercion was sufficient to reduce her conviction to a single count of accessory, which carried time already served. She left the Elkins facility on a Thursday morning in March of 1921 and was met at the gate by Aldous Webb, who had taken a personal interest in her case that had attracted some comment in the legal community. She was reportedly seen in Charleston the following week, and then in Cincinnati. And then, not at all. As for Nathaniel Harper, sightings were reported for years. A man matching his description, bearded and solitary, seen in the Ozark Hill Country of northwest Arkansas. A farmer near Eureka Springs who said a stranger had asked for work for a week in the summer of 1919 and then moved on without saying where. A trapper in the Boston Mountains who said he had found a camp that showed signs of long occupation and then sudden departure, with no explanation of who had made it or why. Brooks retired from the county sheriff's office in 1931, having served as sheriff himself for the last 9 years. He kept the notebook. He never spoke publicly about the case after the trial, though he gave one interview to a Morgantown journalist in 1928, in which he described the investigation in careful and factual terms. At the end of the interview, the journalist asked him whether he believed Nathaniel Harper had been the primary architect of the crimes on Pendleton Road.
Brooks was quiet for a moment, the journalist wrote, long enough that she had begun to think he would not answer. Then he said only this: "The mountains keep what they are given, and sometimes what they are given is a story that someone else needed them to hold." He would not elaborate on what he meant by that. The interview was published with those words as the final paragraph, and readers interpreted them as the philosophical reflection of a man who had spent his life in proximity to the particular darkness that isolated communities sometimes conceal. Some of them may have been right. Some of them were certainly reading something that was not there. It is possible that both of these things were true at the same time, which would have been, in the end, exactly what she intended.